First of all, Anthony, I wanted to congratulate you on 50 books that you've published so far. That's quite an achievement. So
thank you very much. 50 books just seems ridiculous. But I'm delighted to have made the 50. Yeah.
It's been a little while since we talked. I think the morning after the laureate ceremony, I remember playing the shape game with you. Being the Children's Laureate was obviously quite a commitment and a very intense period. And I wondered, in the time that's passed since then, how easy or difficult it was to get back into a rhythm of work, because there must have been a bit of a moratorium for those 2 years, doing a different kind of work. How easy was it to find your rhythm again?
I can't remember what book I came back with after the laureate, but I must have started one while I was doing it and carried on with that. So I don't think there was a great hiatus before and after. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it and really pleased I did it, but it's a great relief just to get back to my normal routine. I've realised as I've got older I am a man of routine, which I hate that idea actually, but I do. I get up in the morning at the same time, I go to work at the same time, I come home for my lunch, back in the afternoon, I work. It's more like office hours really, and that really helps me actually in a strange kind of way.
Has it always been like that, or has that pattern kind of emerged over time?
I think I've always had a kind of northern puritanism in a sense that I feel I ought to be working. But work is what I enjoy doing. It's work is play for me. So there's never a sense of, oh gosh, I've got to go to the studio again. Or occasionally I might have wake up in the morning and think, oh gosh, I've got to try and sort that picture out that I'm really struggling with. But it's not fun. I don't really like that word fun, but it's all so enthralling. I feel so immersed in it all. I sometimes say that working one day on a book, it's a bit like a round in a boxing match. So you go, 3-minute round or whatever, and at the end of the round you've neither won nor lost, but you're still conscious, and it sometimes feels a bit like that. At the end of some days, oh yeah, that was a good day. Others exactly the opposite, and then I go back the next morning and realise that something either wasn't as good as I thought it was, or is better. So I talk about it as though it's easy sometimes, but it's not easy. It's just what I have to do. I don't know what I'd do if I didn't make children's picture books. In fact, if people stopped buying them, I'd probably still carry on doing them anyway.
50 years is a great time as well, I think, to look back a little bit and see, because there are patterns and themes and ideas that recur throughout your books. And I'm sure a lot of that will come to again when we have a look at Hide and Seek, which in some way picks up a lot of those ideas again.
Yes,
I wondered, first of all, if we could talk a little bit about fairy tale. Ever since Hansel and Gretel, fairy tales have definitely been there as a recurring idea. When did that emerge? Is it something from childhood, or is it when you were actually creating children's picture books that you became really interested in fairy stories?
I think it was from my childhood. I don't remember having picture books, not what we think of as picture books now. I used to get annuals at Christmas time, But the constant throughout my childhood was fairy tales. My parents did read me fairy tales, and I'm sure, talked about fairy tales, and I used to get frightened by fairy tales. But I just loved them, and that's carried on, and it's just so much part of my work and my thoughts and my feelings, I suppose. I mean, the fairy tales are still well known even now, even though they weren't particularly written for children, a lot of them in those days, and they've existed and they've lasted for a reason, and the reason being how powerful and strong the imagery particularly is. So it's always been an inspiration to me. I used to think that one day I'll do a big book of fairy tales, just to take fairy tales and illustrate them in my way. But I've always veered off. I've started off with that in mind, and Hansel and Gretel emerged. A few years later, I tried to do a big book of fairy tales, and The Tunnel came out of it, and then later on Into the Forest. So it's a strange thing that's happened. Maybe I will never do a big book of fairy tales. Maybe I want to just concentrate on one at a time, or at least a book of mine which is influenced by fairy tales.
That's interesting, because I would love to see a big book
of
Anthony Browne's fairy tales. There's a great deal of realism actually in your fairy tales, psychological realism, and that's evident through the symbolism that you use. That must be consciously putting that into the stories.
It is now. When I was doing Hansel and Gretel, which was the first fairy tale I approached, I didn't really know how to do it. It was the first book I'd illustrated that I hadn't written for a start. And I was talking to my editor, who in those days was Judy McRae, and I think she said, well, why don't you just go and paint a picture that's vaguely related to Hansel and Gretel. And I painted a picture of the family going out into the forest. And without consciously doing it, I dressed them in up-to-date clothing, or at least clothing from my own childhood. And somehow it worked. It seemed to free me up. It freed me up from being too much influenced by all the other hundreds of versions that there have been of Hansel and Gretel. Most of them rather pretty and beautiful and decorative. And I've got nothing against that approach, but I wanted mine to be more real for children reading it now, and real to my own childhood, I suppose. That's often what happens when I'm working on a book or trying to think of an idea for a book. It comes back to my own childhood. And yes, there were images in Hansel and Gretel that I can see now related to the field at the back of the pub that we used to live in, which was my brother and my playground, and it was full of places to hide or explore or to get wet in the river, and it was full of darkness and lightness, and it feels almost that field was the world of fairy tales existed for me, and I still think it is. Well, I've since been back and discovered things that I'd completely forgotten.
Mm-hmm. I think as well as the psychological realism in them, there's a social consciousness as well. Certainly in Hansel and Gretel, Me and You, I think, as well, has that element to it. How much of that is part of your upbringing, do you think? And how much of it is a kind of commentary on the world as it is today?
I think any book I've done, I realise now, is kind of autobiographical. I certainly don't set off to make a book about myself or my own feelings necessarily, but that comes through in the way that, you know, we're influenced by other stories we've read or films we've seen or paintings or other illustrations we've seen. I think that's one of the influences on me very, very much, what happened to me as a child. And I've always been... I was a lucky child. I think I grew up with very loving parents, perhaps slightly overprotective mother, but very loving. And although we didn't have much money, we were encouraged. My brother and I were very much encouraged to draw particularly or make up stories. Although we were okay academically at school, we weren't tried to be forced into going down the maths or the science route at all. Whatever inspired us, we were encouraged to do. And so, in a sense, I've always had a sympathy for the underdog, I suppose, and I think that comes out a lot in my work.
I think another thread that runs through some of your books is that they are overtly political with a small p. You would take Piggy Book, you would take Zoo as having a political motivation, and certainly Voices in the Park as well. Do you think that this is good food, if you like, for young people, for children?
Okay, that's a difficult one to answer. Ultimately, I don't know. I make the books that come through my years living as a human being, come through my interests, my feelings, my politics, probably, yes, but it's not in a conscious way. I don't think, right now I'm going to do a book about Goldilocks, who is poor, and the bears, who are rich. That isn't how it's done. I start with the original idea, and maybe I'm wondering, in that particular case of Me and You, wondering why we always think of Goldilocks as being a greedy little girl, because she's, kind of broken into somebody's house and stole things. And I thought, well, maybe there's another way of looking at it. Maybe there was a reason for that. Maybe there was certain circumstances that led her to go into the house, led her to eat the food. So these things come through, like many of the details in the pictures. I don't plan them necessarily beforehand. The funny little, strange little things that go on in the background. They come as I'm painting the pictures, and it's the same with the themes of the books, really. I don't start off thinking I'm going to do a book about a lonely little girl who hasn't got a very good relationship with her father. It doesn't start like that.
So is that true also of Zoo? Because it's quite hard for me to imagine that was ever a book about anything other than being a commentary on the place of zoos in modern society.
You've spotted my secret. Yeah, you're right. No, zoo was, in fact. It was. I made zoo when my children were about, I don't know, 7 and 5 or 8 and 6 or something like that. And we used to go to the zoo. And near where I live, there are two, if I can use this word about zoos, very good zoos. One's called Howlett's and one's called Port Lim, and they have very good policy in terms as far as zoos go, but they're still zoos. And we used to go as a family and hear people sort of mocking the animals, laughing at them, feeling superior to them, I suppose. And I think also that book relates to a project I did when I was at art college. I was a rather unsuccessful graphic design student who, for my final year's show, made a project called Man is an Animal. And I was reading a lot of books about animal behaviour in those days. Naked Ape was just one of them, the Desmond Morris book. So I've often made that connection between. I don't think we are separate. I don't think that human beings are these special creatures who are superior to the rest of the natural world. I mean, we are primates after all, and I think it's useful for us to remember that from time to time. So I suppose it also relates back to the underdog in a sense that at the minute we start feeling superior either to other people or other countries or other races or other religions or other species of animals, then I think we're really in trouble.
Talking about political things and children's books, Voices in the Park is a book that it feels sometimes quite an anti-middle class book to me.
No, it isn't anti-middle class. I can see how it could be interpreted that way. And I think it's probably one of the reasons why I changed them from humans into gorillas. I know the original Walk in the Park was thought of as a book about class. And in a sense it probably was. And the woman the female gorilla is kind of, yes, she's posh and she's a bit thoughtless about her child and she treats her child a bit like a dog, I suppose. But I think she's struggling. You know, I used to be quite often criticised for the way I treat men or fathers in my books. And I tend to try and defend them. The father in Zoo was trying to cope with being a father, and I think he found it difficult. And I think in her case, for whatever reason we don't know, she's struggling to be a mother. That's the danger of children's books sometimes. You make one character who isn't very nice, and that character represents men or women or ginger-headed boys or whatever. And we don't do that with adult novels.
I think it's an interesting one. I'm actually glad that I asked you the question because I empathise with Charles's mother quite a bit. And I don't identify with her, I hasten to add, but I do empathise with her.
But the father isn't that great.
But we can feel sorry for him in a way that we don't feel sorry for the mother, I think maybe. Well, I do, but I think by and large people don't. Coming back to your point about characters standing in for the whole of that group, if you like, in a way that's what you said happens with Willie. It becomes universal. And maybe the primate bit makes it universal.
Yes, I think I suspect that's one of the reasons I changed them, although the change actually came just purely from trying to make the characters look more real instead of just types of people. And changing the woman into a gorilla, I think, would get rid of that kind of cliche, posh woman, working class man. It obviously didn't get rid of it completely, but I'd like to think maybe it lessened it a little bit.
Well, you've kind of taken us into the world of primates there. And of course, it's one of the things that, without a doubt, people associate you with books with chimpanzees and gorillas. I just wondered whether you know when a story is going to have human characters and when it's going to have primates.
Well, I suppose the ones where I know what the characters are going to be are the Willie books, which I think I've done 7 of now, and they're always about Willie, who's, as far as we know, a chimpanzee. But one of my favourite letters was from a boy who said, "Dear Anthony Browne, is Willie a real person or did you make him up?" And I thought that was just fantastic. I loved the idea that that child would think of Willie as a person. And whenever I used to go into schools and talk to children about Willie, for instance, I'd say, "How old do you think he was?" And whatever age group I was talking to, they'd usually say he's around about their age. So he's been very useful in that he is kind of universal. He's popular in many, many different countries. He's called lots of different things in different countries. So I always know those are going to be animals. One of the books was going to be Willie the Worrier. Understandably, Willie is a bit of a worrier, and I wanted to do a story about him when he was young. I wanted him wearing short trousers. I remember I wore short trousers until I was quite old, and I was and still am to a certain extent a worrier. So I was talked out of this, and it was suggested that maybe it isn't another Willie book. Maybe it should be about a rabbit or another creature. And I couldn't understand why. It's obviously Willie. Willie would be a worrier, and I'd drawn him as a worrier in the dummy. And I went home and I started playing around with him, and gradually, the opposite to Voices in the Park happened. So I turned Willie into a little boy, but I parted his hair in the middle. He had rather large ears. He walked with his shoulders hunched. He had a Fair Isle sweater, bit rather similar to Willie's. And of course I called him Billy, and this became Silly Billy. So I think many people probably realise that that's either a story about Willie or it's one very much influenced by him. So that was strangely the other way around. With other stories, particularly the ones that start in realism, like Hide and Seek or Changes or Gorilla, because they're starting the real world, I want the child or the protagonist to be, I was going to say real as opposed to animals, to be humans, because I can't imagine how Hide and Seek, for instance, would be improved by turning the characters into animals of whatever sort. So I kind of know they are going to be. The older my children have got, the less easy it is to find a model that I can base the drawings on. When my children were young, they appeared in many of my books. So if a story comes along, it's going to be about children. I thought, oh gosh, shall I try and do kind of nondescript children, kind of almost graphic design children, or children that we know aren't meant to look real, or do I try and struggle with the drawing to try and get the elbow right and the angle of the shoulder right, or shall I ask somebody if I can take photographs of their children? And so I'm always in that dilemma, and it's not easy. And maybe as my grandchildren get older, maybe I'll be able to use them.
Oh, that's interesting. You've talked about Willie being a worrier, and I did just want to pick this up, that a lot of your lone boys in stories are anxious and warriors. If you look at What If, Into the Forest, Changes, these are all lone boys, and they tend to be warriors. Maybe you've answered that a little bit.
But I wasn't a lonely boy. I had my brother. We were incredibly close. We were best friends. And at school, I don't think of myself as alone. I do remember my closest friends at school were generally what might be regarded as the odd boys, the boys who didn't fit in. Boys who weren't very good at sport, for instance. And so it wasn't as though I had much in common with them, but I found myself gravitating towards socialising with them. I don't know, rather than with the in-crowd as I thought of it. And I don't know where that's come from or why, but I suspect that probably is why I'm still doing books about lonely children.
Obviously, we want to get on and talk about Hide and Seek, but before we do that, just one other area that I was quite interested in exploring. There are trademark things about your book that make them recognisably Anthony Browne books, but obviously over time you can see that you've experimented, you've done new things. Into the Forest, obviously, was the first time you used that kind of almost en grisaille technique with the forest and the greys and the whites. Willie's pictures and Willie's stories, the idea of having a book that doesn't have a sequential narrative but actually still manages to tell a story. These are new ways of playing with the picture book format. I just wondered, after 50 books, how do you keep making it fresh and exciting and interesting for yourself?
It is something I'm aware of. I would hate to be thought of as somebody who just keeps churning the same old stuff out until nobody wants to see it anymore. But also, I want to go into the studio every morning with something fresh and new, so that anything can happen. And it's one of the reasons why when I make a preparatory drawing for a final page, it's usually quite simple, because I like to leave spaces to develop things in the background or I even develop a theme of a picture where I might not have even planned what the feeling is generally going to be, or who I'm going to concentrate on, or which expression the character is going to have. So I like to leave it until I'm actually painting the finished picture. So that in one way helps to keep it fresh. I suppose when we make picture books, I think probably all of us, it's partly for children and it's partly for ourselves. And I think if I was to make a book which was too similar to what I'd done before, or a series of books which were too similar to what I'd done before, then I would not have the enthusiasm. It would be a kind of mechanical process of me going through the motions of making another children's picture book. But if there are possibilities for new techniques, new media I can use, then it keeps me interested. And if there's some danger to it that I don't know quite how it's going to turn out. For instance, at the moment, back in the studio, I've just been trying to make a drawing of a girl drawing on the condensation formed on a window. It's the hardest picture I've ever come across in my life. How do you draw condensation with a drawing of a finger going through? I mean, of course, yes, you could take a photograph, but even then, to paint that from a photograph has been so difficult. So I like setting myself difficult things to do, not deliberately. I mean, it happened to be part of the story, and when I wrote that part of the story, I wasn't thinking, oh, how am I going to draw this? But I think it's, yes, I have a fear of repeating myself, but I noticed somebody like Shirley Hughes, who's much, much older than me and been running the business much longer than me, is still taking risks, still coming up with new ideas, and I find that very inspiring.
You talked about trying new media. What sorts of new media over time, or even more recently, have you found yourself experimenting with?
When I made Willis Stories, a series of pictures based on the favourite classic books that Willie remembers from his own childhood, which is probably a version of the books I remember from my own childhood, I wanted the pictures to look solidly real. Like the oil paintings from an illustrator I remember from my childhood, N.C. Wyeth of Treasure Island, Robinson Crusoe, and he painted great big oil paintings. And so I thought that watercolour wasn't going to be able to do this. There is a liveliness and a wateriness, obviously, to watercolour, but a kind of thinness. And I wanted these to be heavy, solid-looking images. So I tried experimenting with gouache, thick gouache. So that was a very different look for me to be, and it was difficult because actually to physically put gouache onto the paper is far more difficult than putting watercolour. With watercolour, it flows over the paper. With gouache, you've got to push it and pull it to get the different colours to merge into each other in a smooth kind of look. But that was a challenge. Not wholly successful, but I still like the book, and generally I enjoyed the process. When I came to do Into the Forest, I was thrown by the idea of all the detail, but not just that as a problem, but all the detailed colours that are in a forest. How long is it going to take me to paint a double-page spread set in the forest with leaves everywhere, with trees, with branches, and not only deal with the structure of the picture, or the drawing, or the textures of the picture, but to deal with colour as well. So that was part of the reason why Into the Forest was in black and white. Of course, I used the black and white pictures in Into the Forest to represent part of the boy's imagination and the fact that he was influenced by fairy tales. But it was also a practical thing as well. And hide and seek, I suppose I felt it had to be in colour. But I developed a new approach to doing children's books. I mean, I've got to a certain age now where I don't really need to rush. I don't really need to do a book a year, not really. And so I started going to the studio and trying to treat each picture as if I was a painter, going into the studio, I'm going to paint this picture, and it will take as long as it takes. And that really freed me up to get involved with the techniques. And of course, because it was going to be a book about, or having lots of things hidden, there was obviously going to be lots of detail and lots of colour to help to hide the detail sometimes. And that new approach was really quite liberating.
We have got to talk about hide and seek. I've been really cruel with holding this until until this point. But the 50th book, did you have in mind that you wanted to do something to mark the 50th, or was this just the next book that you were working on? Tell us a little bit about it and how the idea came to you.
I had no idea that it was my 50th book. I vaguely was aware that I'd done 40-odd books. The idea came talking to my editor, and she said one of the things that she particularly liked about my books, and that I obviously liked doing, was this idea of hiding and revealing things, and things which were behind other things. You might not notice them at first, and then you notice them more and more often. And we'd also been talking about fairy tales, but somewhere between those two bits of conversation, I remembered the thrill of playing hide and seek with my brother. But it was always kind of joyful but frightening at the same time. And I always remembered, as soon as I started hiding, I desperately needed to pee. And I've talked to one or two people since, and did that happen to you? And it has. A lot of people felt exactly the same. And it's just such a simple thing, hide and seek. It's got a beginning, a middle and an end, like like many of the best stories have. And I started to think about how I could use that with my visual way of telling stories. And I just and the forest is all based on a forest that I go to now, and it's the most special, exciting place. Every time I go there, whatever time of year it is, it's absolutely stunning. It's got the most theatrical feel. I once went to a film studio, and I was in America once, and they were filming a Roald Dahl story, and they had a whole set was a forest, and it looked pretty real, but kind of like heightened reality. And that's what this forest reminds me of. It looks such heightened reality that it's almost not real. And of course, you can't help but play the shape game, because so many shapes and things in the distance. And as I get older, my eyesight gets less good. I'm even better at playing the shape game, because things turn into other things. And I just thought this was the perfect place to have this story. So quite a lot of the pages in the book are based on drawings I made in the forest.
I'm pleased to hear you talk about the forest in that way, because as I was reading this, looking at the images, it felt like it was a hymn to a forest.
That's a nice way
they were
to do it.
beautiful, beautiful. And you've given your readers a good idea of the whole concept of what forest is, though, and that's important, isn't it? So I'm surprised. I thought that you probably knew this was your 50th book. So isn't it interesting going into reading it thinking Anthony thinks he's doing his 50th book here? It made me feel that all these things were coming together, but actually it might not have been.
No, it wasn't. But you're absolutely right. They do all come together, all the themes, apart from gorillas or primates. Well, of course, the primates are the two children. But I don't believe there's any gorilla hidden in that forest.
Is that a challenge?
Yes, but there's actually, to be quite honest, I can't actually remember. I tried not to put any gorillas in, but I might have also, the little evil side of me might have said, I'll just put this little one in here, nobody will see that.
These children remind me a little bit of Hansel and Gretel as well. And I think the way that you've painted the characters in this takes us back to that book a little bit.
Yes, I think it probably does. I wanted to try and, in a very gentle way, because obviously the story is quite minimal, I wanted to try and give an impression of the relationship between the girl and the boy by how they spoke to each other. So again, that comes back to Hansel and Gretel, and to a certain extent Voices in the Park, I suppose. But so maybe it is my last book. Maybe I've done it all.
No, it's definitely not. If I can skip to the end of Hide and Seek, there's a surprise there for us, and because we're not talking to children, we're talking to teachers and students. I don't feel so concerned about giving away surprises. But these children, actually, they live in a caravan or they're on holiday? I took it that they lived in the caravan in the forest.
Well, because I painted the picture and wrote the story, it doesn't necessarily mean that I know whether they live there or whether they're on holiday.
There aren't really anything like enough stories about people who have alternative lifestyles. So it was a real joy for me turning that page and seeing that.
Hidden reveal, I suppose. As was the building in the background as well, near where they were. So I wanted there to be something else revealed.
It's a high-rise
flats,
block of flats, isn't it? That reminded me a bit of Zoo and the final scenes in Zoo and the cityscape and the contrasts.
Yes.
So couple more things that I wanted to ask, and certainly your work in the past has been obviously influenced by art. I know that it's something you feel passionate about. Is that something that's still continuing to bring new ideas and fresh ideas, your experience with fine art?
Yes, I think so. I've often said I think I'm probably more influenced by painters rather than other illustrators. Although I look at other illustrators' work and admire many illustrators, and actually don't see a huge difference between illustrators and painters. In actual fact, I don't see this dividing line which the cultural world seems to put up. But yes, going to an exhibition of paintings is one of the joys of my life. A bit like going to a forest, in fact.
You have talked in the past about how you came to children's book illustration via mortuary art and I've forgotten what that is. Medical illustration via greetings cards. Today, a lot of courses exist for training young people to become illustrators and indeed to become illustrators of children's books or even undergraduate courses on children's book illustration. Do you sometimes wonder what it might have been like if you hadn't fallen into this world of children's book illustration? Where would you have gone with your art?
I dread to think. I did twice try to become an art teacher. I went to Goldsmiths for half a day. And I went back to Leeds for 3 weeks, but I realised I was going on the course for the wrong reason. I was thinking I could be an art teacher because it'll give me time and space to paint my own pictures, and that probably isn't the best reason to become a teacher.
We can't imagine you as anything other than a children's book illustrator, Anthony. And looking ahead, there's a new book, is there, in the offing?
Yes, the book I'm working on at the moment is based on the Mexican painter Frida Kahlo. It's a story that she told about herself when she was 6 or 7. Well, it's not just that story, it's based on that story, and I've tried to relate that story to the rest of her life in a way. So but basically it's about her when she was a little girl, and it's proving to be one of the hardest books I've ever worked on.
I know you've been to Mexico quite a lot.
Times,
did that interest in Frida Kahlo's work come from there?
Yes, very much so. I've been to the Frida Kahlo Museum, I think 3 times now. And although I can't pretend she's one of my favourite artists, or even possibly, dare I say, she's probably not a great artist, but I find the whole package, her story, her pain, her suffering, her paintings, her relationships with people, her politics even, fascinating. And the book is quite difficult because it's the first book I've ever made that's very obviously about somebody else.
I think you have painted her before, haven't you? Didn't you paint her self-portrait in Willie's pictures?
Yes, well remembered. Yes, I did. And she was, or her estate was one of the few estates that said I could. I was allowed to do that. A lot of the paintings that I did had to be not used. So yes. So and of course she loved monkeys too. So I'm finding all sorts of similarities. She longed to fly. She had this idea that she wanted to fly, and so she wanted a toy plane for her birthday. But when she woke up on the morning of the birthday, she found that all her parents were given her was a pair of straw wings. Now that reminds me very much of the little girl in Gorilla, who reminded me of myself when I asked for a trumpet and I was given a plastic toy trumpet. So I'm finding all sorts of connections, which is helping to make the book more personal, I suppose, for me.
I think we're going to enjoy it very much when it arrives, and I think it'd be lovely for the many fans that you've had in Mexico for over many years, I know, who keep inviting you back there to see something of their art and culture in your books. I know that Hide and Seek is going to be hugely enjoyed by lots of children, just as I enjoyed it. And thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you very much.